Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Extend Your Identity Investment to Privileged Accounts, Establish Governance and Reduce Vulnerability for Privileged Access. I'm Shay Mann and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded and we will email you a link to the recorded version tomorrow. Because there are some statements in this presentation that cover future functionality, we're required to put this nice little disclosure here. We'll just keep on going. All right, joining us today is SailPoint's Senior Vice President of Corporate Development, Joe Gottlieb, and also Identity and Data Governance Strategist, Frank Virgulio. And with that, Joe, I will pass it over to you to get us started.
Well, thanks, Shay, and welcome everyone to our webinar. I'll go over the agenda very briefly here. First, I want to start with some industry and market perspective just to set the context for this particular topic of managing and governing privileged accounts. Then I'll talk a bit about how these different solutions operate separately, what their respective points of view are and what they attempt to deliver in terms of their solution value and value proposition. And then we'll get into how they work better together, right? What does pulling these two systems together afford you as a practitioner of identity and access management addressing the need for governance over privileged accounts? And then last but not least, I'll have Frank step in and do a demonstration of some of the functionality so you can see these two systems working together in concert. So to dive right in, from an industry standpoint, I've said this many times before, some of you may have even heard me say this before, but there really is an amazing collision of two urgencies here. We are really required these days to lock down privileged access because of all of the threats that privileged accounts represent, right? The threats are going after these privileged accounts. They get the most leverage for these, and we'll talk about that in the context of the attack lifecycle. Meanwhile, there's this ongoing need, as all of you folks are well aware of, to continue to manage systematically who has access to what, right? So there's two really urgent directives here that are underway, and yet they're being addressed with two different types of solutions. But the advancing audit frontier is increasingly putting pressure on enterprises to have very solid answers and audit confidence with this question: when did you last certify your privileged accounts? And that really makes us think about, well, if I'm investing in a attestation or certification tool and process and program, I would like to be able to leverage that program to address these most precious privileged accounts as well. And so that's really what this is all about. And frankly, it's an opportunity for the different teams that are involved with these different solutions to start to collaborate. And in fact, on many levels, because these two solutions are so adjacent to each other, and there is a little bit of overlap, it is a familiar opportunity, a familiar place for these two groups to work together and to make some progress happen in their organization. So to just zoom out now on the overall sort of industry, we all take a look at the Verizon, data breach investigation report that comes out every year. These trends, I would say, are still very consistent, right? We're seeing the motivation behind the attack still being largely financial. This is all about really harvesting customer records so they can be sold online and through various mechanisms, right? That precipitates your biggest brand damage risk and also your regulatory risk. By the way, espionage, which is also like the second most typical motivation, is also a form of business motivation as well, but that gets into your deep, dark secrets. So in both cases, there's plenty of very proactive motivation for the attackers to be coming after us. Meanwhile, the threat actions, hacking and malware predominantly, the methods are still predominantly consistent. We're seeing a little bit more of a rise in the social, but that's been pretty active over the last couple of periods here. So leveraging social attacks for sure is often the first way in when paired with these other methods of using malware, i.e. software, to precipitate an attack, and hacking, which is typically an expert on keys, leveraging these technologies to be able to penetrate your organization. And meanwhile, this data is also still quite consistent. The attacks are happening very quickly. The compromise, the occupation of your infrastructure is happening very quickly, and the dwell time before discovery remains very high. So that sets the context for what's going on, and also for the methods that we might use to mitigate this risk, right? If you've got a high dwell time, right? And the attackers are camping out in our networks and on our systems to be able to harvest data or do their damage, right? That gives us more time to mitigate the threat, right? Yes, they're getting in quickly, but they don't do all their damage at once. In fact, some of the best attacks are low and slow and very patient in harvesting data so that they can go undetected. So if we can do a good job of reducing that attack surface area by good governance of privileged accounts, we can really mitigate the risk given this, this tendency and trend that we see in the way these attacks play out. Now, many of you have seen this picture. It is a classic attack life cycle. Really, an attacker today is coming in with any means that they can. They want to get purchase on one machine. And typically, this is where the social attacks have been the most effective, where you can get, all you got to do is get one user to make one click, one mistake. And I recently heard a stat that is supported by some of these same statistics coming out of this research, that if you go after 10 people, right, there's at least 10 people, there's a 90% chance that one of them is going to click on that social attack. And so even though that's a relatively low conversion rate, it's all that's needed. And so you see that you don't have to span your net particularly wide to be able to get at least one victim. Once you get that first victim right, then the approach is to move laterally. And more you're seeing various methods on security enforcement and the best trends to try to reduce that. But our goal is to make sure we really lock down and minimize the surface area for privileged accounts through our governance operations, which we'll be talking about today, because that is the place that they're trying to get to. They're trying to move laterally to get to the high leverage accounts where they can literally start manipulating infrastructure, getting wholesale access to data, creating more accounts to be able to do more subversive things without detection, etc. And so if we look at the data, right, 80% of security breaches involve privileged credentials. And that just makes, it's basic common sense, right? And so we're not shocked to see this borne out in the data because this is where the most leverage exists. We also see from our studies that 67% of those surveyed cannot produce a report of who has access to what within 24 hours. And I think that just measures the state of the industry, frankly, in terms of adopting pervasive governance techniques and programs, and that's really how we're trying to bridge that gap so that this stat on the top can be mitigated through effective governance. So now let's take a look at these two different solutions and see how they operate, see what they each do to set the context for how they can be used better together. So today's situation typically is, Jane, the IT engineer, winds up getting access to stuff to do her job, and she certainly gets basic stuff to do her knowledge worker stuff like office work and email and access to basic systems. But in this case, because she's an engineer, she also has some privileged accounts that involve the infrastructure that she in particular needs to be able to access to do the more specific part of her job. Right? So this is just a classic scenario where for many of our employees or contractors or partners, right, they need a combination of access to fulfill their roles and to keep the business moving forward. But the fact is that these situations are often delivered separately, and I'm going to jump to this page, right? The deployments of PAM and IGA are typically separate, and they're not addressing the common view of this user in typical form without the level of integration that we're talking about today. If I go back, now let's take a look at what each of these systems are doing, right? In the case of PAM, you're getting deep controls for these privileged accounts. You're getting credential lockdown, credential rotation, credential vaulting, right? You're also getting account control and session control and continuous monitoring. So these are very different things, right? They're literally for the privileged accounts, first of all, they're in the path of the bits, they're involved with the login, they're able to rotate credentials based upon policies. They're able to shield the actual value of the credentials and the passwords and the keys and things like that from the actual users so that they really create a very, very solid bridge between the authentication and the login and the actual access and the privileges that are in the back, which we know are so precious. Then they're able to do session control and monitoring, and increasingly are doing threat analysis and threat response based upon observed behaviors with privileged accounts. Meanwhile, on the identity governance side, we think about broad governance, horizontal policies for discovery and provisioning, access certification, access requests. So that's our governance programs that you folks are driving forward that literally are trying to stripe across the entire organization. If needed, deal with different business groups a bit differently, right, through some federated approaches, but ultimately imposing some enterprise capabilities across all accounts. Unfortunately, those programs, without the integration of these capabilities on the PAM side, are often not reaching in to the privileged accounts, which arguably are the most important to govern. So what are the implications of this? We see an increase in dormant privileged accounts or orphan privileged accounts that may not be connected yet to a group that may yet be discovered by an attacker moving laterally. Remember, that's part of that surface area. If we go back to that attack lifecycle, the attacker is using a combination of very directed and random and crawling means to go find these things that exist, right? If we reduce that surface area by pruning back dormant or orphaned accounts, really, really important to mitigate the risk of that attacker coming in. Obviously, for any given user, we'd like to prune back. We get entitlement creep. If we're not involving these two systems, integrating them together to benefit from the governance process, privileged users are going to wind up having more access than they actually need. We might also have errors, right? We may have, errors in provisioning privileged access because we aren't doing it systematically based upon policy with an automated form. We could be doing it via a very manually administrative approach, which we often see in a lot of the separate implementations. And of course, we lack the centralized visibility and auditing and reporting, and we could also have a loss of productivity. Without the automated, rule-based provisioning of these privileged accounts, people might not get the tools they need to do their job as quickly as we'd like them to. So let's talk about now, that's the setup, right, for why could these things be so much better working together by integrating identity governance and PAM. So when you pull these things together, right, you now take these horizontal capabilities in the governance and you bring them across the deep controls that the privileged account management systems are providing. And we're working with all the players in the industry, frankly. We're working with everyone from CyberArk, the market leader, to even our competitor, CA, right, is a player that's integrating their capability. And in fact, that was recently certified, the CA Exedium PAM capability that they acquired, even though CA just got acquired by Broadcom. Interesting movement in the industry, right? That actually is certified. This slide is already a little bit out of date. So we've already had a lot of work with these partners in certifying on prior generations of our integration options, and we're going to talk about the PAM module being our next generation integration capability that CyberArk has now certified for here in a moment. But let's talk about this really, the key payoff here for each user. If we look at the user level, right, we're now going to be able to see their standard accounts, their named privileged accounts, as well as their shared privileged accounts, right? And so now we've got great visibility for each user. This is really important because when we assess the risk involved in the collective access of each user, only when we integrate these capabilities can we now have that great visibility at the user level. So when we're contemplating the role of that user either in their vulnerability to a phish, or maybe if they're a disgruntled employee, maybe we have a high concern with their likelihood of being involved in one of these attacks, if not directly involved in fraud. Now we can see and assess that risk by really being able to roll up all of the accounts that an individual user has. So really, really important payoff for the governance program. And over the years, we've evolved the methods that we've provided to be able to integrate these. And you see with the striping colors here, between the product capabilities, the implementation efforts, and the manual processes, our goal has been to continuously deliver you more of the solution out of the box in the product so that your implementation efforts can be simpler and more timely, along with any remaining manual process that you may yet have to wrap the capability. There's always something, right, that isn't yet covered in the scope of our respective programs. And so I think we're being very authentic here about that reality. But the whole goal here, as we've evolved the portfolio, is to help you really get more out of the box and to really become more efficient in pulling these capabilities together. So if you look at those vertical pillars in gray behind, right, we started out with a bulk importer, super manual, one way, get visibility for basic compliance on a periodic basis. Then we delivered STI, the simple structured table integration capability via JDBC. That was a database, a two-way data exchange. With the PAM module, which we'll talk about, we're now using the SCIM standard for exchanging data between the governance system and the PAM systems. And now we're certifying our partners utilizing the PAM module so that we can not only take advantage of that more standardized plumbing, but as we get to the extension to the user interface in Identity IQ that we've added with the PAM module. And the last one there that I mentioned is IDSA, and this is just something to keep an eye on. IDSA is the Identity Defined Security Alliance that we're involved with, along with a bunch of other identity management and security vendors. This is something that was originally founded by Ping and a couple other security players and Optiv is now the steward for this, and I happen to sit on the board. The whole goal of the IDSA is for our common enterprise customers to make this identity-defined security technology easier to pull together in a way where we still have to earn your business every day, but you have a portfolio that is delivering a much higher value with ease of implementation and ultimately allowing you to have a better ability to mitigate your risk. So that will also, the reason why I included on this chart is because part of that effort is providing a capability maturity model. So you can actually start to quantitatively measure your ability to reduce risk through these integration capabilities that we're delivering as vendors in the programs. Okay, if we zoom out now on the topology of this universe, right, I want to just comment on how our work with the privileged account management vendors is playing into a broader effort with some really important adjacent players. So what I like to start with, though, are directory services, right? We're working with a variety of vendors as partners that have directory services offerings, and this is really, really important because good directory hygiene is foundational to not only an effective governance program, but also an effective PAM program. And what you find is when you try to pull these two things together, you're once again reliant upon this good hygiene at the directory level, at the group structuring level. When now you skip over to the privileged account management system, what I'm finding and what our customers are finding is the choices you make for your naming convention for your vaults or your safes or whatever the PAM vendor calls them is really, really critical because those then become the units of provisioning and then of ultimately governance and certification of these collections of privileged access that you want to put together in a safe where you've got the protection of a vault, you've got credential rotation. It's an assignable unit like we say in the governance world, right? Okay, so the naming convention for those that you're using for your PAM system becomes really, really important because that implies a bit of a hierarchy that you're utilizing to segment the way you're handing out privileges. And so that doubles with your directory hygiene to allow you a nice solid platform to be able to leverage these systems in concert. And last but not least, on the access management side, typically you're utilizing single sign-on and multi-factor authentication to make sure you're employing the best practices to authenticate users even before they get the ability to use these privileged accounts and the entitlements within them that we're, of course, governing with the identity governance program. So hopefully that gives you a feel for how you can start looking at these systems and how to evolve them as a portfolio in concert. And while there are no hard rules for the sequencing of these, it's always smart to architect for the ultimate destination where you're going to be utilizing these technologies together. So again, you can achieve if multi-factor authentication is the singular, highest priority in your organization to mitigate a risk or to deal with an audit finding, you're going to go after that just because you have to. But along the way, you're going to want to think about how you're looking at groups, for example, and scenarios for access where you're going to have step-up authentication. That's going to definitely come back to groups and scenarios you have for your users. That's going to be something you leverage with the other technologies as you go forward. Now, if I zoom out even more broadly, right, I just want to place you in the context of our overall vision as SailPoint. At SailPoint, our continuous focus is on delivering an open identity platform to deliver the identity governance capabilities that allow you to get more value out of not only adjacent identity and access management technologies like access management and PAM and directory services, but then also adjacent security technologies and also IT operations and infrastructure technologies. So giving you the best possible reach and the most thorough and effective operational coverage of all these systems, and increasingly with more advanced use cases that allow you to mitigate risk. So that's really what we're all about here at SailPoint, and we'll continue to make partnerships and evolve those partnerships so that you get the straightforward approaches that you're looking for to be able to manage these portfolios and the value that you're delivering to your respective organizations. All right, let's talk a little bit now about the PAM module. So what does the PAM module do, really? At the most basic level, what the PAM module does is it allows Identity IQ to understand containers, right? Identity IQ has always had very strong capabilities to think about users and applications and entitlements, right? So those are specific ways of looking at the infrastructure, the world, your complete digital access portfolio, right? But it has lacked the natural ability to contemplate what a container can do. And so what we'll talk about today when I talk about what the PAM module does, that's really the functionality. So what does a container of access look like? You know, who's in it? What do they have access to? Etc. So that's one key thing that the PAM module does. It's literally an extension of the UI of Identity IQ that allows you to have a container view as opposed to just an individual user view or an application view or a manager view. Secondly, what it does, as I've alluded to, is it now leverages SCIM to really standardize the data exchange with PAM vendors. This is going to streamline and accelerate not only the ability for us to work with a variety of PAM vendors, but as we go forward, adding more use cases and more sophistication and more scenarios where we can be better together, that standardized plumbing is going to serve us so well because we won't be reinventing, a bunch of hard-coded stuff that doesn't translate to those future use cases because we've done it a number of different ways with different players. Let me now double-click on the logical architecture of the PAM module. Right? And I was just talking a little bit about this at the highest level. So Identity IQ can now see these containers, which frankly originate in the PAM application. It is the PAM application, whether they call them containers or vaults or safes, that is the unit of access that these PAM solutions are typically providing. Right, so that's like, their unit of value or their sort of their unit of access that they're doling out and allowing you to manage is at that container level. Now within a given container, right, you can see the users that have access to that container. That would be maybe direct access or cumulative access. You see the groups that have access to that container, right? So that's the effective access that an individual user gets by way of membership in a group. You also see the container ACLs. What is X user able to do to the entitlements that are available, the accounts that are available in this container, right? So that's a really important concept here, right? Because some users may only be able to have read access. Maybe it's read-write, but not create new, right? So that's a really important aspect of the the ultimate access that the user has. Then last but not least, the privileged data represents the actual entitlements inside the accounts that is really the mother lode here. That is the ability to, in a given account, be able to perform tasks that we know, if they're in these privileged account containers, right, are going to be pretty important stuff. Admin type capabilities where, write capability or edit capability happens to be super powerful, not just in its own right, but because it's available on very precious systems or very broad pieces of infrastructure or, deep capabilities that admins tend to have. So all we're showing at the bottom here is You've got the capabilities of privileged access management, credential vaulting, session recording, etc., happening and being performed on these containers. And of course, Identity IQ, with this integration, maintaining an equivalent visibility and, in effect, a database structure of these same containers, we can now perform the things that we do on the governance side, the visibility, the provisioning, deprovisioning, certification, audit, access request, etc. Okay? So hopefully you can see that picture very, very clearly. We're, in effect, maintaining a consistent data set so that we can perform our respective functions on these privileged accounts, groups, and users. So to touch on then, and this is going to sort of detail further the benefits that we will also summarize with. What do we get when we look at these systems operating together in terms of centralized visibility? So now you can actually get visibility into all users, all of their access, no matter how they got it, and whether it's least privilege or escalated privilege, or maybe even in some cases temporary privilege, right? You can aggregate the container and safe contents beyond just accounts and look at that. So now you can actually look at what a safe or a vault has in it and who has access to it. And so when you're think about you're managing your group structures, you're managing the way that you're going about making requestable and provisionable and certifiable units, right? By your ability to view the safes, you're now able to understand those units of access that are being doled out by the privileged account system in that work. You can also now search and filter. You can quickly query these things and find out who has that access, and that's typically very, very critical as you evolve your ability to bucket users, groups, any role engineering you're doing, etc. On the lifecycle side, it's very, very straightforward. So the same concepts that you know and love in lifecycle management, we're now able to apply to privileged accounts. So like we said before, if these systems aren't working together, maybe you've got a great lifecycle system that Identity IQ is delivering on, and it's got the trigger from HR, you know what role that person's in, you get them their day one privileges right off the bat, but meanwhile, you've got a ticket that is driving an administrative effort to go add the privileged accounts without that same level of automation and same level of systematic, policy-driven certainty, which of course reduces your error rate. Really, really, really critical. And then of course with automated lifecycle management, we can mitigate the entitlement creep that we alluded to in one of the downsides of not pulling these things together. And we can also have I already said, less error-prone fulfillment, both day one and with subsequent transfers, the mover scenario, and of course, super, super important. I mean, if lever is important in the general case, lever is 10 times important in the privileged case, right? If we've got people leaving the organization that should no longer have access, we must terminate their privileged access as a matter of supreme importance. Policy management, right? So now, by being able to have visibility of these accounts, being able to associate them with users, they are now part of our scope and our ability to be able to impose separation of duty policies on them so we don't get toxic combinations. And you would imagine a lot of the most toxic combinations involve privileged access, right? Because you could have a very minor toxic combo that has limited scope. Let's say, the classic scenario is creating vendors and paying vendors, right, in the fraud world. But let's say you could only do that for a very small part of the organization or a very small aspect of the business apparatus, right? If you could do that for a really, really broad portion, you're now, really, really extending the impact of that toxic combo. And so being able to ferret out those toxic combos with policies that can see the privileged accounts is really, really critical. And then, of course, again, the certification. So a lot of these things, as you see the pattern here, they work as they would normally work with the same mentality that we apply to access requests, lifecycle management, recertification, etc. We're now able to do this with the privileged accounts included. Future use cases that we're looking at will be, for example, securing, rotating, and controlling access to the privileged account credentials that Identity IQ has. So we're actually working on integrating in this case, at least CyberArk, so that we can leverage CyberArk to house the credentials that Identity IQ needs to have to go interact with all the target systems. So really important development there. We're adding the ability to flesh out more scenarios for access requests for PAM containers and safes. Another key one is certifying the contents of containers and safes. And this will really get us into the world where we're now bridging another level of the operational use of these two types of systems, right? Today, we're able to leverage this integration to do all the things that we do in the governance world for the safes that exist. We'll be adding in the future the ability to actually certify new safes that are being built. Actually, before they're created, make sure we route them across the stakeholder group that's needed to certify the contents of those safes and the access that we intend, so that we can now have better governance of the creation, i.e. the frontier, the ongoing evolution of the privileged account management portfolio. And then SOD policy checking, not in the generic sense that I mentioned before, but now actually when PAM is, when the privileged account management system is creating a new safe, checking for SOD violations before actually creating a safe in the first place, because you wouldn't want to put a safe into motion and make it available if it had a toxic combo within it, right? So checking that in advance by querying Identity IQ is another feature we're looking at. So I'm going to zoom out now a little bit and talk about, okay, this has been mostly about technology, mostly about integration, but let me now leave you with a few thoughts to keep in mind as you advance your program, as you think about how this technology evolves, because this stuff is more applicable to the way you're thinking about your approach and your policies and your program. So if we look first at the ability to have centralized visibility across all user access, right? Some things to think about is who should have that access. That visibility is very powerful. So how might we be federating that access and actually reducing the risk of what community of individuals can actually see all of that? So something to keep in mind, right? You might want to start to federate that visibility so that you compartmentalize it and reduce your risk. You also want to think about how, because the main use of that, of course, a couple things. You might use it for troubleshooting. You might use it for role engineering and things like that. But being conscious about who you're allowing to see all that is something to ponder. So if we then look at the automated lifecycle management for the provisioning and deprovisioning of privileged accounts, this sets up a new thing to ponder, right? How do we migrate from what today is largely a super admin club administration approach to enabling privileged accounts? How do we now wrap that with the same governance purview that we tend to have in the overall governance approach? Now, that thing that I mentioned earlier, that ability to certify the contents of a container before you even make that container available is really, really key. And I allude to that actually in this last one, right? So in the last case, right, recertification of access or certification upon provisioning of new access, right? That's a really, really important thing to start thinking about how you imagine how the life cycle evolving, right? So this, you can clearly see here that these two groups need to start working together. And if you have the benefit of the two groups being one, or largely being one group with specialists involved within that one group, that will be a bit easier. But really staying close to each other and comparing notes and iterating on how these two things get more seamless is really, really important. The third one there that I skipped over, centralized and comprehensive SOD policy management, this is really, really critical, right? So now if we've been doing this at one level before, how do we expand the reach of our SOD policy structure to include the privileged accounts that are now available with this reach that's given via the integrated systems? So some things to think about. I alluded earlier also to the naming conventions involved on the PAM side. I alluded to directory hygiene as another really important thing to be pondering as you work with these technologies. And so no matter the sequence, or if you're into all of them now, but you're evolving how they perform certain tasks and you're retiring, you're prioritized next new features, thinking about how they work together is something that will help you get the most payoff as you go. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank, and he's going to take us through a bit of a demonstration of how these systems work together. So, Frank, take it away. Maybe you want to set it up first with this slide.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. During the demonstration, I'm going to demonstrate provisioning in a couple different ways for lifecycle management. I'm also going to demonstrate a policy that's being enforced. And that policy, different than what Joe was talking about, was actually going to show some suitability. And then we're going to go into an access certification, time permitting. So what we're going to see is who has access to what, who granted that access, the complete visibility, are they suitable? All those answers to the questions that we're really trying to drive with our governance program. What you'll see about the environment is I am doing this live. I'm connected to a sample PAM application. The data might be a little different that you will see if you're using CyberArk or Psychotic or one of our partners. And so I just wanted to point that out. The other thing is what I'm demonstrating is available today in the current release, and this has been available since version 7.1. So we're going to go ahead and get started. A little bit about the scenario. We have a new user to the organization. Amanda Ross here that I'm going to log in as the manager of the resource. She is going to go in and, assign her new employee some access. She's going to, ensure that he has everything he needs to get his job done. So today we're going to use Sam, and we're going to request access for Sam. Actually, prior to doing that, she's actually going to attempt to add him directly via the PAM module. So very easy. He's a Unix admin. She'll come to manage. And what we see here is the Unix admin container. The administrator can see who has access via direct. They were directly assigned. And then those that have effective access. So I may have roles that have the groups in my PUM or some other group that is granted by a birthright role or some other means. We're going to detect all this behind the scenes thing when we do an aggregation. So that's going to be your effective access, and that can be very powerful in detecting that entitlement creep. So what group is giving this effective access? It's a Unix admins group. The administrator or the manager can see the identities, the permissions on the accounts. So you can see, whether you can change passwords, use passwords. You can grant these individuals, and I'm going to go through that step. And then you can see the permissions all the permissions in the container, not just what that group has. So what we're going to go do here is we're going to come back and we're going to add our new employee. We're going to add Adam Thursday. So we see Adam doesn't have a PAM account associated with his identity yet. So I can't even assign him. And that's critical because we may have corporate policies that are going to drive his access. It might, like I said, it might be an SOD policy. It might be a suitability thing, right? And that's what I'm going to go ahead and show here. So just as you normally would as a manager or an employee, you're going to request access. And this is just to create the PAM account. Now we could also start requesting the individual groups and roles, but I'm just going to do basic PAM right now to create his account and get him started. So we select this. This is our normal process. We're going to go into the access review. We can time box it here, so I can say he only needs this for the weekend, and then we'll go ahead and deprovision that access. So we're going to go ahead and submit. While we're submitting this, there's an evaluation going on in the background. this policy I have created is actually checking to see if the user has a certain piece of training completed. So we may have a corporate policy that any privileged account, they must have, not only be in the right role, but they also need to have certain ticks about them, certain metadata. So we're going to go ahead and allow the manager to submit a policy violation with a justification. And this is going to live with this request forever. So this becomes very key in your audit. We're letting this user make this request and make the manager allow the request because she knows he's completed the training. So, but the decision ultimately is going to be done by someone else. So we have that separation. We're going to come in here as a different approver now. And one of the things that's, going to happen is when we look at these requests that are being tracked, so what we're going to see is that request is going to require an approval of the manager. The user would know where the request is in the process. So we're going to go ahead and just process this override. From there, he can see all the details, the comments that go through with it. So he can go ahead and approve it. Now, the manager, the employee are all going to be notified that this is going to process through so they can actually go in and get things done. So what we're going to have happen now is we're going to come in back as that manager, and we are going to request that same access now. So we'll come into the PAM module. We're going to grant that access now to the end user. So we're going to go to the Unix admin accounts vault, and we're going to add the identity. Okay, Adam Thursday. So we're adding him back in. We're only going to grant him use password. So this is where we can come in and assign direct access to a certain privilege and not granting bulk access. So we'll go ahead and submit. And now this user is going to be granted access. So when we start looking at this, going back, we see the effective access. We see the groups. We see Adam's been granted that direct access. So he's now going to be a member of the group. But he's been granted that access, as we talked about, on the direct basis. So once we pull that data and finish that provisioning step, remember we're live, there's a couple things happening in the background, he's going to show up in all these environments. The next critical thing is now that we've provisioned the user and we go back and look at the identity itself, all right, we look at Adam. So this is going to live throughout the system. We see his access that he's been granted, and we see his roles and entitlements. Well, we see that on his entitlements, he's a basic PAM, in the basic PAM group that we assigned him via the access request via the manager. He's also been granted the use password. So under accounts, we're also going to see his privileged account here. So that kind of completes the life cycle and policy piece of this. We've seen the centralized visibility. We can now, use our analytics and reporting, and we're going to see all of this information show up in our reports and in our history and in our compliance efforts. So now the access certification piece, I'm going to shift gears here and use an existing access review that I have configured. And you see here as the manager, she's way overdue. So she's overdue, so she's time boxed in getting her reviews done. And some of the newer things that we can do here when we look at our open reviews is we can start filtering. So I may filter on recent changes. So that's what I'm gonna do what I need to first, right? I'm gonna make my my heavy job of performing 85 certifications. I'm gonna make it easy, and I'm just gonna do the ones that are recent changes. So this is our standard process, but wanted to just point out the importance of being able to, make those approvals to the critical accounts in a timely and effective and efficient manner. So if we go ahead and approve here, we're going to just, process as we normally would, follow the approval steps that might be necessary beyond this or the sign-off. Also, if we revoke, we're going to completely deactivate that account based on our application policy. So this wraps up my portion of the demonstration and discussion. I hope this helped you, and good luck with your privileged efforts.
All right, thanks, Frank. So to summarize, really this is kind of a call to action, right? I mean, if you believe that all the things that we talked about in the very beginning about the way the industry is evolving and the attack surface area and the most biggest call to action to mitigate risk is to do a better job of not only locking down these privileged accounts with a PAM system, but to then govern those accounts via an identity governance system and program, then I think these things will be pertinent to where you're headed. First of all, understand that both of these things are urgently needed. They do different jobs, but combining them is increasingly a best practice and frankly increasingly required to address that emerging audit question, which is when did you last certify your privileged accounts? You can leverage the technology the work we've done with the partners to integrate these technologies. Frankly, that's a bit of the easy part. Yes, it continues to evolve, and there'll be more features over time, but really this is about evolving your process. I think the challenge and opportunity here is to start looking at this holistically and thinking about opportunities where you can add more value with the governance program by helping your company get a bigger payoff from its investments in these respective systems. And remember, as I showed you that broader landscape, right, ability to leverage these two systems in a better together format also accrues benefits to the other investments you're making on the access management side, single sign-on MFA, on the directory side, on the security operations side and security enforcement, on the mobile and service infrastructure side. So all these things should stand to benefit if you can really start to collaborate with your peers that are responsible for these different systems and work together to make progress on each while architecting for progress as a whole. Really, really key point. So with that, I'm going to close and we'll turn it over to questions. But as I do, I just want to share that we actually are running a promotion on the PAM module. So until September 30th of this year, we're offering a discount. We're really doing this because we just think that this is such an imperative, right? We think so many of our customers are going to find this is extremely relevant. Personally, I've never seen two technologies being pushed harder together and therefore more of an integration imperative than these two technologies that we're talking about here today. So we want to help to make that possible for you via this promotion. So with that, Shay, let's dive into some questions.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, our first question. How will these IGA plus PAM solutions be supported?
That's an easy one. So each of the respective vendors will support their technology. Because we have partnerships with these companies, we have processes to work together when a common customer is working to troubleshoot an item. So as you would expect from a very active partnership scenario where we're going to work together to make sure our respective products are supported, but in combination in your environment is really, really key. So we underwrite that experience with you.
Excellent. Okay, so do I purchase this from SailPoint or from my PAM vendor?
Well, again, you're going to get the products from the respective providers. So the PAM solution would come from the PAM provider, and the SailPoint solution obviously is going to come from SailPoint. The PAM module is something that SailPoint is offering exclusively, so you'd have to get that from us. and that's what allows you to have that container view that we were showing off today. But so you'll get the stuff from the respective parties or your common channel. You know, I know Optiv, as an example, is partnered with both CyberArk and SailPoint, as well as SailPoint and some other of the PAM vendors that are out there. So there are other routes to get both of these things from a common player, if that suits you as well.
Okay, great. Where does Psychotic's secret server fit in? Are there any plans to integrate it beyond the existing STI offering?
Absolutely. So we're partnered with Psychotic along with several others, as I showed. There is an existing capability that we have certified for our prior generation of PAM integration via the STI method that's mentioned in the question. And I know Psychotic is working to complete their reintegration, the revision of their integration to work with the PAM module. I don't have a date for that. I think they'd be the best source of that information to check with them.
Got it. What is the estimated release that some of those future use case items will come out? Certification of contents and container safes was originally scheduled for 7.2. Is it now scheduled for 7.3 or beyond?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think if you're looking for specific features on a priority basis, I would really urge you to work with your customer success team to make sure that you're flowing that input into our process, because I just happen to be looking at a backlog review for this capability, and we're continuously looking at that input to try to optimize. The recertification capability is something that I can't quote a date for, but that is something that you can ask directly of. Ultimately, it's going to be our product management team that will respond. I know that the leveraging of a vault to front our use of the sensitive credentials for our target systems has been promoted as a very high priority feature. So that's just something that might come first. So sorry to give you kind of a half answer there, but that's something that we really want product management to be involved in the dialogue on.
Got it. Thanks. Frank, this next one may be good for you. Can a user request access themselves?
Yes, and what I showed was a manager requesting access for the sample account, but most certainly the user could have logged in, done that same request from the catalog, and then been provisioned the account based on the approvals. Also, going down into those entitlements and group memberships, that could be a requestable object too. As I stated when I started the demonstration, I'm showing one way of doing it. Most certainly there are other ways to enable the access request based on your enterprise needs.
Got it. Okay, and one more, Frank. Can others besides the manager be selected as an approver?
Sure, and that could be the application owner, and then as we do in our flexible business process editor, we can add additional approvers. We could have dynamic approvals. We could do further checks. So our same business process that we have for application provisioning, account provisioning, that's really, we're using those same processes behind the scenes for this. So yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Joe, back to you. Does it help with service accounts as well, for example, to know what permissions that service account has in the domain?
I'm going to let Frank address that one.
Okay.
Frank, put you on the spot.
No problem. So sure, we're going to see those service accounts if Identity IQ is tracking them, and if they're in the PAM containers, we're going to see them. We're going to provide all that governance over them. So yeah, your service account strategy can be mapped to this capability as well.
Okay, excellent. All right, that is all the time that we have for questions today. Keep an eye out for an email from us tomorrow. That will include a recording of today's webinar that you can share with interested colleagues or listen in again. If you'd like to learn more, go ahead and contact us using the information on your screen, and we'll get you in touch with an identity expert. We will also be sending you a solution brief on extending identity governance to privileged accounts if you'd like to go ahead and dig deeper. Joe, Frank, thank you both for presenting today. Thanks to everyone who joined us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.